Ladies and gentlemen of our Scriptures for America tape ministry, this is Pastor Peter Peters to introduce this message, which is an interview with Emmanuel McLittle on Martin Luther King holiday. This interview took place on our radio broadcast January 15, 2001. I think you'll find it to be an interesting message. I guess is what they call it. And my guest tonight, we'll be bringing him on shortly, is a man that's going to be talking about that. It seems like every year I make sure that I do my part in helping you to remember Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And I'm not going to do anything different tonight than what I've done in past Martin Luther King radio broadcasting nights. We have a track, I wrote it, called Martin Luther King, Jr., His Dream, Our Nightmare. And it's an 8-page track, and if you'd like to have it, we'd like to send it to you. If you're interested in truth, here's what you do. You simply write to us at Scriptures for America, Post Office Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535 USA, and request Martin Luther King Jr. track. It's 8 pages, and we'll send it to you free of charge. It's our way of doing our part on this Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. Or you can call 307-745-5913 and request it that way. Leave your name and address, and we'll send it to you. For those of you who want to go a little bit deeper into the subject, we carry a book called Martin Luther King, The Man Behind the Myth by Des Griffin. And it's about a 50-page book, very, very well documented, and it tells you the story about Martin Luther King Jr. that, well, the lying liberal media does not tell you. If you'd like to have this book, you send us a $6 offering, and we'll send it to you. Again, the mailing address is Scriptures for America, Post Office Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535 USA. The scripture that came to my mind tonight is one found in the book of Hosea. I want to read it to you. It says in Hosea chapter 5, verse 20, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. And woe to those who are hero in drinking wine and valiant men mixing strong drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe." Let's stop there a second. Can you imagine that maybe that might be going on today, that somebody, maybe a lot of bodies, are justifying a wicked man for a bribe? This morning I did a radio broadcast. It's broadcast 14 on our Bible law lesson course. And I talked about the scripture there in 2 Timothy chapter 4 about preaching the word, being urgent in season, and Paul said to Timothy, out of season. What does it mean, out of season? Well, it means you tell the truth even when it's not popular, even when they brand you a racist and a bigot and a hater and a neo-Nazi, and you name it. They've labeled Pastor Peter as that. You preach it anyway. Well, there'll be a lot of people maybe listening tonight that are going to have that Pavlovian knee-jerk reaction as we begin to delve a little bit into the truth about Martin Luther King Jr. They have lifted him up as a saint, yet the record is clear. Plagiarization, womanization, exploiting his own people. It's there if you start checking it out. Our guest tonight is a man that I have never met personally. I've only talked to him on the phone. He's actually done, his messages have gone out on the Scriptures for America tape ministry. And one of our most popular tapes is a tape called Truth from a Black Prophet. And I'm not trying to puff him up, and I hope he doesn't think I am when I say this. He is definitely one of the smartest black men I've ever known. And I'm not so sure, not that I've known that many people, but if he's not one of the smartest men I've ever known, God has definitely given our guest, Emmanuel McLittle, a tremendous amount of wisdom. And it's an honor to have you here tonight. Are you there, Emmanuel?
I am here.
And thank you very much for being a guest with us tonight.
Thank you for that introduction as well as that prayer, because I do hope in earnest that God guides my words. I am still have as much pride in me, perhaps, as the next man, and listening to your glowing introduction of me may be cause for me to make a stumble. Well, I will do my best to share it with you, because I, too, have such a love of the truth. And what else should we love? The truth gives us the breath that we breathe. The truth created the earth that we walk on, the atmosphere that we live on, created the spirits that dwell in all of our beings. And so for a man not to love the truth, as you and I and so many other Americans do, is a form of suicide, just like the suicide that was hoisted in a national sense, hoisted upon this country when the left, the evil left, it forced all of us to worship a man who himself was as clearly evil as any other national figure that we know.
You used to have, before we get into that subject, I kind of want to give a little bit of background to my listening audience about Emmanuel McLittle. You used to have a black magazine, or a magazine that was for black people, and you told the truth in it. And what was it called, and how long did you have it?
It was aimed towards all Americans, but particularly aimed towards misinformed, ignorant, politically led, worm-type, lying black people who had no other real clear voice of logic in the national press. The name of that magazine was called Destiny, and I named it that because I wanted to suggest to some of its darker-skinned readers that the destiny, which I believe that the Creator laid out for us, was nothing like what we were experiencing, not only in America, but if you look the globe over, you will find people of color, black people, the people whose skin tone I share, in the dredges of poverty, some of the worst off people that there are. And I don't happen to believe this nonsense that black people are bad off as we are. All over the continent of Africa, in most places of the United States, the entire country of Haiti, and nearly every other country where blacks dominate, so does poverty, so does ignorance, so does a clear lack of understanding of who our Creator is and what He intended for us to be as human beings. And so, Destiny was a magazine that tried its best for 10 years to describe a different destiny for us. And in doing so, it attempted to point out how we blacks in America were being misled by the history books, were misled by the politicians that we serve now, and that is an accurate description, serve politicians now, and how our very own education had made us disdain the very country where our freedom, our wealth, and our well-being was assured more in the continental U.S. than anywhere else. We have been taught by the left, by the Marxist left, to hate the very hand that feeds us, and therefore have plunged ourselves to the very lowest of the totem pole, lower than any other race in the country. Here we are in this country 300 years plus, and we do worse economically. We are not as well off socially. We have a little bit of political clout, but even that we use wrong. And our children are more likely to go to prison than any other. Almost 80% of our households are without a man. And we die at an early age, not because of the racism we're told that kills us, but because the vehemence that has become part and parcel of our nature and hatred of a land that was really designed for our freedom, despite the brief period of slavery. Destiny magazine talked about this extensively and attempted to pave the way for us to begin to realize the common sense truths that gave us such wealth and such ability and such an education in terms of being here in America. The magazine didn't succeed. It has given way to a much smaller newsletter that I now call Philosophically Speaking, which is a much smaller version than Destiny magazine, only 8 pages. But that newsletter goes out every month, still talks about the same common sense, tries to erect the truth in a place where the truth had been trampled underfoot, and thank God that the newsletter is surviving a little better than the larger magazine, which drove me out of business, I don't know, more than 3 years ago.
Of course, the us that you're talking about are black people.
Yes.
And I want my audience to recognize that.
And,
now, how would they...
And when I want to clarify that a little bit. I'm a man who happens to have dark skin, black skin, matter of fact. But that is the only part of me that is black. I do not believe that it need be that any human being's heart be black. I believe that the Creator meant for there to be black, dark-skinned people. I believe that the array of colors that we see in human beings all over the earth was meant. I do not believe, as I've said on your radio program before, that races ought to mix, creating colors that God did not make. I believe that we ought to all exist here on this earth as brothers and neighbors in spirit and not in gene pool.
Amen to that. I don't want my grandchildren marrying your grandchildren.
That's correct.
And you don't take offense at that, and I don't take offense when you say the same thing to me.
That's right.
By the way, let's tell the audience how they could get your newsletter. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you will subscribe to Emmanuel McLittle's newsletter.
Again, as I said, the newsletter is directed towards people of common sense of whatever color, but particularly aimed towards blacks who have any affinity in their heart for common sense truth.
Well, I was talking to a white preacher out in California just the other day, and I told him you were going to be a guest of mine on the radio. He said, you know, I get that man's newsletter, and it's really good.
Yes.
How do they get it?
800 is the toll-free number that anyone can call for a copy of that newsletter, and someone will send you out a free copy, $36 a year, and you obtain it by calling our toll-free number at 800-545-5842. That's 800-545-5842 for information about Philosophically Speaking.
Please mark it down, ladies and gentlemen, and call Emmanuel's number, and I encourage you to subscribe to his newsletter. It'll help him, and it'll bless your life.
Yes.
Emmanuel, you and I have never met, but how did we ever get acquainted to begin with? It has to do with this day, doesn't it?
Well, I tell you, it actually does. And I don't know whether it was 10 or 8 years ago, somewhere in the vicinity of 8, 9 years ago, that I sat in my office listening to a profound speaker talk about why Martin Luther King was not a hero and why we ought not to look at him as an example for blacks or any other race to follow. And that speaker happened to be Pete Peters. And I jumped out of my chair where I was sitting, having not long ago written an article of the same nature that attempted to tell the truth, a truth that Reverend Abernathy, a friend and close confidant of Dr. Martin Luther King, also wrote about him, about the philandering and the women and the prostitutes and the whores, usually whores of different races, never black whores, always white ones, who Martin Luther King slept with in nearly every city in which he traveled. And when I made this discovery, and I made this discovery via people who were on the trail marching with Dr. Martin Luther King, sleeping in motels with Dr. Martin Luther King. Several of them wrote publications, including Dr. Abernathy, whose book has been banned in nearly every public library and nearly every institution, especially black institutions, who denigrated and caused Mr. Abernathy to die, I believe, a premature death. But his book, I believe it was called The Real Dr. Martin Luther King, describes events and characterizations of Dr. King that no one would believe had it not been for the fact that there are 10 to 12 file cabinets full of videotape, of audio tape, of written reports by hundreds of FBI agents, state police in nearly half of all of the states in America, documenting who Martin Luther King was in a personal, moral, and political sense. And when I heard this man speaking late at night, I believe it was 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night that I heard it on a Michigan radio station, I was thankful to God that someone knew and believed and dared to speak what only I and a few others in my race had discovered. And I was actually a little afraid at the time to express this in a magazine that had just begun, fearing that such revelations would cause my immediate demise. Well, when I heard the voice of Peace Peters tell me what I already knew about Dr. Martin Luther King, I made an attempt to call you, and I think I did the next day or two, to compliment you, not just for telling the truth, the very obvious truth, what everybody in the media knows, everybody in government knows, is no secret to the people who push our buttons and motivate us, taking half to nearly 60% of all of our money in taxes. There's no secret to those people. And it was no longer a secret to me, validated by a man that I'd never met on a radio station that I'd never heard. I tuned into you that night by total coincidence, never expected to hear the words Martin Luther King come out of that speaker that night on my way to another place on the radio dial.
That's an interesting story. That's quite a story. And we've had a lot of conversations since then, but we've never met, have we?
No, we haven't.
We're looking forward to it. What the people out there that are listening tonight, one of the advantages I have by having you on the radio is that it's a little bit harder for them to call you a racist and a supremacist when you tell the truth about Martin Luther King.
It's a little harder, and it's even more difficult when you hear me tell you that despite what you might think of me, I really don't have a racist bone in my body. I hate no one. Not only do I hate no one on the basis of race, I hate no one, period. It violates,
Amen.
It violates everything in my spiritual code of ethics to hate another man or a woman.
Let's talk about something that you and I have talked about in the past. It's like there's a spell has been cast across this land, whites and blacks, victims of it, but particularly let's talk about the blacks. They think they're better off now since Martin Luther King and civil rights. What's your opinion?
Well, it's because they're so ignorant that so many of us who were young, very young, when Dr. Martin Luther King had his heyday, his 30 minutes in the sun, I call it, that we are unable to compare the fact that all of our dollars bought so much more. That despite the fact that there were occasionally places in this country where one could go and find whites sitting in one part of the theater, blacks sitting in another, whites sitting at one lunch counter, blacks sitting in another. And what I might want to say here about the conditions of the early 1960s, culminating in the 1964 and 65 Civil Rights Act, was that as a 52-year-old now, looking at the history of back then retrospectively, let me give you and your audience a shocker, and I don't know that I've ever told you this, so I hope that it doesn't disturb you at all. I do not believe that that kind of separation and what we now think of as segregation was entirely wrong or evil. I believe that we were two different Americas. I believe that there was a black America and a white America. I also believe that they should be now. I believe that it's very conceivable that there are natural reasons to explain why blacks live in clusters all over America, even after the most sweeping set of laws that we know of as the civil rights legislation have been passed 30 years ago. I'm not denigrating individuals who live in integrated neighborhoods. I believe that men and women ought to live where they want. And I believe that to try to explain away the reality of why 97% of all minorities and 94% of all the majority of the population live separately is an anathema. I think that it is natural. I think that we associate with each other in a natural way that tends towards our own kind. And I don't mean simply racial kind, but racial kind, social kind, cultural kind, spiritual kind. Like kinds associate. Like kinds are familiar with each other. Like kinds mate together. Like kinds live together. And therefore, nearly all of the city of Atlanta is black. Nearly all of the city of Detroit is black. Nearly all of the city of Philadelphia is black. And it's no coincidence, nor is there anything wrong with whites living in areas that were separate. This is the scene on which we visit the 1960s and 1965, when Martin Luther King was thrust upon the national stage. And it was the environment in which the civil rights movement came, and all the laws, which I believe are laws that have done more to rob Americans of liberty, peace of mind, happiness, fortune, than any other set of laws we've ever created. I believe that all of the civil rights laws are themselves not only illegal, but immoral. I believe that those laws did not come from a God who created nearly every man with equal access to himself. Equal access. I believe that my prayers are heard as Pete Peters' prayers are heard. But who God loves more and who God favors, one must be inside God's mind to find that out. And I am not. Nor is anybody else, I believe. And so I say to you, and I say to your audience, that something horrible took place in the 50s, in late 50s and early 60s, and culminated in what we think of as the civil rights movement, on the basis of people living and doing business in often, not very much, but often separate situations. It was in this environment that Dr. Martin Luther King thrust himself in a movement propelled by Marxists inside this country and outside this country to make things equal and accessible for black Americans. I beg to differ. Things have not been more advantageous for blacks ever in the history of our country, and we are still not equal. The equality itself is a bogus terminology, but there is no man or woman equal to another. This is the sin. This is the horror of what we commonly believe to be the era that finally finished freeing black Americans. I say no. I say we are far more imprisoned psychologically and politically than we ever were. I say that the communists and the Marxists won with the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act. I say that there was nothing holy and nothing good about the entire period, and that Martin Luther King himself was not only a fraud, but probably the worst individual liar, individual deceiver in the hands of puppet-like Marxists ever to hit the stage of America.
Ladies and
So not
gentlemen,
to say
My guest tonight is Emmanuel McLittle, and that's the voice you're hearing. Emmanuel is hooked up through telephone lines. He's out in Oregon, and of course we're broadcasting here on Worldwide Christian Radio. Christians are supposed to broadcast the truth. If the truth is offensive to you, are we supposed to stop telling the truth? If you'd like more truth along the lines of what Emmanuel is talking about, I'm going to make it easy for you tonight, and not even costly. We have a important little tract which I wrote several years ago called Martin Luther King Jr., His Dream, Our Nightmare. If you want documentation about his morality, his honesty, his plagiarization, his communist connections, it's all in this tract, and you can have it for free. You simply write to us at Scriptures for America, Post Office Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535 USA. That's Scriptures for America, Post Office Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535 USA. If you enclose a $6 offering, we'll send you this excellent book, about 50 pages it is, by Des Griffin. No, it's about 70 pages, called Martin Luther King, the Man Behind the Myth. And if you write this phone number down, you can call this number after the broadcast, 307-745-5913, and leave your name and address, and we'll simply send you the tract if you want to do it that way. And I would hope that many of my regular listeners will hear my request that you subscribe to a most excellent newsletter written by Emmanuel McLittle. And to do that, the 800 number is what again, Emmanuel?
800-545-5842. That's 800-545. About in my very next issue, we're going to describe to what extent the civil rights movement has wreaked tort havoc on hundreds of corporations in America, sued by people in our own federal government and lawyers on the basis of racial discrimination, who have taken millions on top of millions, if not billions, in lawsuits for discrimination, 80% of which we know never took place.
It's a form of blackmail, isn't it?
It's a form of blackmail. And not only is it a form of blackmail, but it's worse than that, because blackmail often comes by way of a note or a telephone call or some kind of intimidation. But here, we have the force of a federal government with the strongest military in the world behind it, telling people, that Bill Gates is the latest one, that he will have to pay millions and millions of dollars in court costs, as well as suit money for people who are claiming racial discrimination as employees of Microsoft. Before them, Texaco, $75 million. Before them, Denny's, nearly $85 million. And the list goes on to nearly 100 corporations that we know of who've allowed their records to be searched and their names to be published and the amount of money to be known, of the kind of money that they have given to people who have intimidated, sued, or intimidated them out of money on the basis that they were racially discriminated against in businesses, in hiring practices, and in employment. No such thievery, robbery is what we call it in our next cover story. No such robbery has taken place on this grand scale ever in the history of America. And it continues today. It will get worse before it gets better. And I'm hoping that it fails to produce what I believe some of the Marxists in this country want. And I believe this. I believe that somebody wants blacks and whites to fight in the streets. I believe that someone wants chaos. Do they want chaos in order for blacks to finally achieve the so-called unattainable harmony? And harmony is a thing of the heart. You can never get it from politics, and you could never get it from race relations. It is simply impossible and unrealistic to even look for. Are they going to fight in the streets for equality? Equality is a status that's not possible if you base that on race. There's nothing equal in this entire country that can be had that one man cannot have. In other words, if it were possible for you and I to function at the exact same level, mentally and physical, then equality might be possible. but that's impossible. You have abilities that I don't have. I may have abilities otherwise that you don't have. And so this whole notion of equality has been thrust on the American people for God knows how many decades is an illusion. It cannot be had. There is no possible equality between two people, let alone two races of people. And so we're constantly having to deal with one form of intimidation after another. And what is positively puzzling me, Pete, is that how it is that 10 to 12% of the population has suddenly gotten the power to intimidate the other 70, 80% of the population is baffling to me. How have white people allowed themselves to be so intimidated that they not only will stand up for their country, they've lost the will to stand up for their families, to stand up for themselves,
to stand up for their race.
To stand up for their race.
I mean, they're scared to death to do that. It is amazing, isn't it?
Absolutely befuddles me how it has come about. It befuddles me. At 52 years old, I thought I understood much of what evil is. But I can't possibly understand and still have questions in my mind about how men of goodwill, white men of goodwill, ran away from Europe in an attempt to find a land of freedom, found it on the North American continent, established it, fought for it, built a nation based on freedom and the love of God, and in a mere 225 years have lost it to one of its smallest minorities. How could it be?
It is pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yes.
Boy, you have a way of putting it right down there where you understand it. You know, let's also talk about this. Before the Civil Rights Movement, there were black families with mothers and fathers.
80% of us. 80% of us had mothers and fathers and intact families. And not only that, we lived in intact neighborhoods. And we didn't know that we didn't have a lot until Marxists came into our communities and told us, this is the kind of cars white people drive. Why don't you have them? These are the kind of jobs white people have. Why don't you? A certain amount of antagonism began to create a movement that we commonly think of as the Civil Rights Movement. And this movement was not entirely black-generated. This movement was not entirely black-generated.
Well, that's most definite. From what I've been able to see and look into, it was Jew-generated out of New York.
It was people in our government. It was, in fact, as you say, people from all over the northern part of the United States, and especially from New York, especially from New Jersey, especially from Washington, D.C. and Baltimore and Detroit and all of those places that were supposedly the places of safe haven for black slaves. But even that is a contradiction, because there was as much slavery, there was as much cruelty towards blacks as the so-called white Southern whites. And so what is puzzling even now to me is how white America has fallen and seemingly unable to even buy one TV station. And you have three major networks in this country, and good people, good conservative people in this country cannot own one voice of common sense, honest reasoning to broadcast to its own people. It's the most insane thing.
Well, and another thing, look at all the black young people today who are dying, and if they're not dying, they're going to prison. I don't know what the figures are. Do you know what the figures are?
Yeah, I do. I do know what the figures are.
It's terrible, isn't it?
It's a sad thing that nearly 50% of the 80% of who's there are black men.
Now, that wasn't the case before the civil rights, was it?
No, it wasn't the case at all. It has never been the case before the civil rights movement and before the Johnson and Kennedy administrations, when things begin to suddenly turn around. And things begin to suddenly turn around when we began, and I say we, because, and I shouldn't say we, because it wasn't me. I wasn't in those Marxist corner offices in New York who made anarchy the thing to do, who made rebellion and hatred the thing to be if you were black, who invited people to throw firebombs and stone stores and beat innocent white people in riot after riot after riot all across this country from the early 1960s all the way through the early 1970s. No one can be so foolish as not to have seen the film footage of people like Reginald Denny being beaten in the streets. And that's one documented case. But there are thousands and thousands of documented cases all the way up until just a year ago when the protege, protege of Dr. Martin Luther King, the so-called Reverend Jesse Jackson, went to Decatur, Illinois to protest the expulsion of 8 black young men who beat to a pulp white innocent bystanders at a football game. The horror is still going on. A minority of black people, and I say they are a minority even within our race, because the majority of black people are decent, loving, and they love their families, and they even have an affinity towards what is right and good for America, as I do. We do not want to see the horror that has visited the United States in the name of our race, and we do not want to see all-out brawl in the streets of this country between white rebels and black rebels. We do not want to see a continuation of the left in this country constantly use blacks as they did in an effort to steal the most recent election in favor of Al Gore instead of George Bush. Blacks were used to try to steal this election, not only in Florida, but in a dozen other states where blacks were paid, in some instances, cigarettes, food, and money to go to the polls. And when that didn't work, to protest and lie to the cameras about their votes counting or not counting. We are still, despite the fact that the riots of the 60s are gone, we are still in a bit of a war, a bit of a struggle for what will be supreme in this country. Affirmative action, you owe me, reparations kind of mentality coming from groups like the NAACP, or the sanity that we see represented by former Senator Ashcroft, who probably will not be confirmed as Attorney General on one basis alone, that he is a white Christian.
And that is the one basis, isn't it?
The single basis.
Yeah.
To be honest with you. One basis. He dare speaks the name of Jesus in public, and he is white.
I noticed on the news tonight, now they're equating on the news, because he spoke at Bob Jones University.
Yes.
So
did I.
Before they caved in to the liberal left and the media and started allowing interracial dating.
Yes.
Because he did, that makes him a racist. I thought, what the insanity we've got in this country.
Yeah, what insanity.
Back on another point I want to make here, and that is, I learned this from Richard Hoskins. You got to understand, I grew up in the West. I grew up, there were no black people around. I didn't live around black people. I don't want to live around black people. But I understand back in the South, he did, and he said that in the South, before the civil rights, that black people had their businesses. They had their own businesses, and they really expected you to go to, not to their businesses, but to the white businesses. And see, all those businesses were taken over. I mean, today, the blacks don't have those businesses. Somebody has them. I maintain it's the liberal establishment. It's the Antichrist forces that it was all economics to begin with in pushing the civil rights. What do you think of that?
Yeah, some of it was economic. Certainly, back in the 1890s and 1900s, 1920s, there were probably dozens times more black businesses that were self-sufficient, businesses who hired not just blacks but whites in many instances, banks, grocery stores, people who had mining claims and pumped huge amounts of coal, diamond, cobalt out of mines. There were the employment numbers for black Americans were way up into the 90 percentile. Nearly all of us worked. Nearly all of us had a place to stay. Many of us owned our own homes. And until the civil rights era, and so what if there? And I'm saying so what in an earnest sense. So what if our schools? There were two schools. If there were schools that housed black Americans and schools that housed white Americans, I don't have any problem with that at all, because now we have seen that there is benefit in learning one's own culture, learning at one's own speed, learning what one wants to learn in order to be able to function in the economic system in America. We outlawed it in the 60s and indicated to everybody that was white that there shouldn't be segregated schools. But we never said this about black schools. And there are as many, hear me well, there are as many black elementary, junior high, high school, and colleges that are all black as there are white.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest tonight is Emmanuel McLittle. This is Pastor Peters. We are broadcasting live this Monday evening, January, I should say, the 15th, which is Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday being celebrated across this land. I want to encourage you to take advantage of my guest's offer to send you a free newsletter. You are offering a free sample, is that correct?
I'm sending a free sample to everyone that will call to hopefully later subscribe to the newsletter, and especially to get our next issue, which will be out in about a week to 10 days, that is called Robbery in the Name of Race. And Robbery in the Name of Race is going to describe how we have come to a place in the 21st century where it is more advantageous to be black and suing someone for racial discrimination than to be Bill Gates, almost.
And they would get your newsletter by calling
800-545-5842. That's 800-545-5842.
Emmanuel, do you mind if we open up the phone lines?
No, not at all.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to call in tonight, the number is 307-745-5913. 307-745-5913 is the call-in line if you want to call. And I want to take this moment to tell you or remind you to be sure to tune in tomorrow night, because you talk about truth. This coming week, the rest of this week, we're going to be dealing with World War II. We're going to have tomorrow night a guest who went in on D-Day on Utah Breach, Pastor Earl Jones. You're going to hear history of World War II from the American soldier side. The next night will be Gunther Kessler, a German soldier, and you're going to hear it from his side. He actually shook Hitler's hands twice, and they both of these men, the American and the German, found out who the real enemy was. You'll find next couple of nights kind of interesting. Hello, this is Pastor Peters. You're on the air. Go ahead.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello, sir. Hang on, I better turn down my radio.
Okay. Yeah, whenever you call, ladies and gentlemen, turn down the radio.
That.
Okay, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Illinois.
Go ahead.
I think what's going to happen now that George Bush is the president-elect and going to be the president, there's going to be a real big push for so-called hate crimes legislation. Now, my point is, it's going to be the first time in American history where motive hasn't gone to establishment of guilt, but motive itself is a crime. Yes, and I'd just like some comments on that.
Okay, well, comment. Thanks for calling.
Okay.
Go ahead, make comment.
What's interesting about looking at motive as a means in which to prosecute someone for so-called hate crimes is that now the left pretends that they can do only what God says he could do. And God says that he is the only person able to read the depth of another man's heart. And that's exactly what you'll have to do in order to prosecute an individual based on what his feelings were when he committed a crime. And that is exactly what hate crimes legislation will do. It will attempt to base an act of violence or otherwise on an individual based on how he felt about it, especially if he committed a crime against an individual that was not of his race. Now, I also share the suspicion with many people who suggest that this legislation is partially designed in order to legitimize or help legitimize the homosexual movement.
Amen.
Another boondoggle, another disgrace from those people who tell us, who've been telling us that all is equal inside black and white America. Now they are thrusting on us via the vehicle of the Civil Rights Acts the fact that homosexuals are also a part of that so-called equal group, and this is in large part who the hate crimes legislation is aimed at. If you're white and you commit a crime against blacks or homosexuals, you may be prosecuted for what is being euphemistically called hate crimes. But I've never, ever seen a documented case for blacks who commit 80% of all crime against white ever prosecuted for hate crimes at all.
Emmanuel, we have another caller from Pennsylvania. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I'd like to say, I got a couple points. First of all, I commend this gentleman for speaking truth.
Amen.
I've wrestled with this situation in my heart as a Christian and what God has revealed to me. The only thing we have a right to hate, we can't hate each other. The only thing we have a right to hate is evil. Wherever it lodges itself, we must expose it for what it is.
Yes.
And
you even must be careful about how you hate evil.
Well, all evil is not is of the devil.
Yes.
And it is the work of the devil. And what we see happening in our society today, especially with the media in Hollywood, promoting such evil. We can have our beliefs, our standards. We can desire to live separate, but yet where we come together naturally to respect one another, this is what God would have us to be.
You notice that when the left tries to bring us all together, and they try to do it by legislation, they try to do it by force, they try to do it by all kinds of means, but never do they ever suggest that we come together in our hearts to love one God. Ever do they suggest that?
They never suggest we all come to the feet of Jesus and love him, do we?
Never.
Do they? Thanks for calling, sir.
Can I say one more thing,
Okay,
Pastor
sure.
Pete?
Mm-hmm.
You know, understanding prophetically what lies ahead for America, I believe that a racial war is coming. And I believe that white people and black people, children of God, must recognize this for what it is and stay away from this.
And we also must recognize that we cannot possibly go to war, that in a real war, blacks would be the losers because we don't have the numbers, the guns, or the fortitude to fight such a war. And not only that, if we did have all of that, it is a third party, not white, not blacks, but the Marxists who propagated, spent the war into its existence, who will win.
Yes, and is using this as a tool.
Thanks for calling.
Thank you.
Well put. They kind of get together and say, let's you and him fight.
Yes.
Hello, this is Pastor Peters. You're on the air.
Good evening, Pastor and Mr. McLittle.
Good evening.
I'm holding in my hand a little pamphlet, and it's called An Anti-Communist Negro Makes This Appeal. Please Don't Help Glorify Martin Luther King by Mrs. Julia Brown.
I know her.
Do you know her?
FBI informant.
You know her personally?
Belonged to the NAACP and informed the FBI about what the NAACP was really doing behind the scenes.
She said,
Absolutely.
she said Martin Luther King is the worst enemy my people have ever had.
Yes.
And do you mind if I read this little, very fast? Mrs. Julia Brown spent more than 9 years as a member of the Communist Party in Cleveland, Ohio.
Yes.
Serving as an undercover operative for the Federal Bureau. She surfaced in 1962 to testify in Washington about her experiences and how to describe how the communists plan to use Negroes as cannon fodder.
Yes.
In their program of racial agitation, today she continues to risk her life on coast-to-coast speaking tours, exposing the communist-led revolutionaries who pose a clear and present danger to Americans of every race. And also, there's a check here from the Southern Conference Educational Fund given to Martin Luther King for $167 from New Orleans. And I am so sad in my heart when I think of this pitting against each race for the Jew. And believe me, they are the head, the B'nai B'rith, the highest Masonic order in the world, Mr. McLittle. And if we do not recognize this, we are lost, and I thank you.
Thank you for calling.
And I tell you something else. A greater motive than we believe was at foot when Martin Luther King's birthday was given national holiday status. If you consider the fact that no other leader ever in America has a day set aside for celebrating his birth, life, or death, no other individual in American history has a day celebrated as a national holiday to celebrate his birth, life, or death. And the first time we do it in American history, we do it for an individual that we know lived an immoral, lying, deceitful life, who we know was a Marxist in a democratic republic, Christian nation, who we know instigated such division at every level of government that we don't even recognize the politics that form current-day America.
Emmanuel, let me take this call. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Yes, sir.
Where are you calling from?
North Carolina.
Go ahead.
I, some time back, when I heard about this world government and so on, I did my own research, and I sent off for a subscription to the Communist Party newsletters and all this, and they admitted in there that Martin Luther King couldn't get funding, so he got funding from Paul Robertson, who was the head of the Communist Party at the time.
Hey, thanks for sharing that with us. We're going to have to cut you off here.
Okay.
We are running out of time. Looking at the clock here, and yes, somebody did fund him, and of course it's okay to use the term communist, but let's put it in proper perspective. Let's call it Judaism. That's what it is, and the Jews have funded him. I don't know if I can take... I'm going to try one more fast call, Emmanuel. Hello,
okay,
this
go
is
ahead.
Pastor Peters. We don't have much time. Real fast. Hello? And, hello. Yeah, just hold on a second. Now, let's see. Oh, guess they hung up. Emmanuel, one last time. Robbery in the Name of Race is the name of your coming newsletter.
Coming newsletter. It'll be out next week or 10 days from now. And it is an apt description of how the civil rights laws, which I suggest must be repealed for America to survive its original heritage, has served to allow minorities, homosexuals of all stripes, to sue people in the name of race for what is coming on to be billions and billions of dollars, nothing more than the part and parcel of the Marxist redistribution of wealth in America.
And here's how you get it, ladies and gentlemen. Call 1-800-545-5842.
Yes.
1-800-545-5842. Emmanuel, we're about out of time. Will you come back on and be a guest sometime?
Will do. Anytime you call, and it's a pleasure to talk with you again, Pete.
Thank you so much, and God bless.
And you too.
Bye-bye. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us tonight. If you want to have our track, Martin Luther King Jr., His Dream, Our Nightmare, we want to send it to you, and we'll send it to you free of charge. Call 307 745-5913. Leave your name and address and we'll send it to you. If you want the book, Martin Luther King, The Man Behind the Myth, it's available. It's about a 70-page book. It's available for a $6 offering. Write to us at Scriptures for America, Post Office Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535 USA. Remember, tomorrow night, the rest of this week, we're going to have some real interesting guests. Not that tonight's was not. And if you stay tuned the next hour, you're going to hear Pastor Peters bringing a message on Bible law and money. And I hope you will stay tuned. Again, our address is Scriptures for America, P.O. Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535 USA. May the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob bless you, keep you, make his face shine upon you, and be gracious to you, and lift his countenance upon you, and grant you peace. In Jesus' name, amen. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. There'll be no outro tonight.